My name is Bill Deakin. I'm Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Manchester, and I'd like to talk about the possibility that the onset of schizophrenia and the psychotic symptoms is some kind of manifestation of a neuroinflammatory process. And if we could understand that, we might be able to find treatments that prevent the onset of schizophrenia. So we've known for many years that the onset of schizophrenia, the onset of psychotic symptoms, is associated with changes in the structure of the brain. And you can see on the right-hand panel here, structural images, horizontal sections through the brain of a group of patients with the at-risk syndrome who haven't even got symptoms, formal psychotic symptoms yet. And you see from the study of James Stone at Imperial College, the blue areas are medial prefrontal cortex, where there are apparent reductions in the amount of grey matter in these structural brain scans. And this process seems to continue into the early years of psychosis, as shown by the two classic studies on the left, one by Lieberman in New York and Columbia, and the one in the middle from the Utrecht group. And they both show the same thing. These are longitudinal structural brain imaging studies in the first episode of psychosis, and they both show losses of grey matter in medial prefrontal cortex, shown by the hot areas on the left-hand side and the color pixelated regions in the midline in the middle block. So at the top of the middle block, you see some loss compared to controls, and in the bottom one, that's got more over 5 years. On the left-hand side, you can see the hot areas where grey matter has been lost. Furthermore, both of those studies show that the apparent loss of grey matter is greater in those treated with a typical antipsychotic, haloperidol. And on the left, those who had olanzapine for 1 year seemed to lose less grey matter. And the group in Utrecht, the middle panel, showed the same thing. You can't see it there, but the result is the same, that those on clozapine lost less grey matter from medial prefrontal cortex. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's loss of neurons. There's not much evidence for that. Most people think that it's maybe loss of synapses, but it might not even be that. It could be some sort of disuse atrophy. We don't know what the cytoarchitectural basis is of this grey matter loss. But assuming it's some sort of neuronal change, the results suggest the possibility that atypical antipsychotics might have a neuroprotective effect. And we've been interested in the idea that neuroinflammation might be the mechanism. And if we could understand that, then we could find treatments that would prevent schizophrenia. So there's evidence that neuroinflammatory mechanisms could be relevant to the pathogenesis of schizophrenia. A lot of interest in that at the present time. Here are 7 lines of interest. So briefly, the genetic studies in large consortia with tens of thousands of patients compared to controls is enough to pick up small effects, but which are nevertheless consistent, showing that regions in the major histocompatibility complex area of chromosome 6, this is part of the genome that's to do with how we deal with antigens and autoimmune disease, that is a risk region. Variants in that region confer risk for psychosis. And correspondingly, there is a good epidemiological evidence that autoimmune diseases are more common in people with schizophrenia and in their relatives. Furthermore, studies have measured in the blood levels of inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, CRP there, or IL-6, and this meta-analysis, amongst others, shows that there is a consistent increase in the periphery. Does it happen in the brain? Less consistent evidence, but here is an impressive study carried out just recently showing raised cytokines in post-mortem brain samples of people with schizophrenia. Most interestingly, perhaps of all, are these patients who had antibodies to the NMDA glutamate receptor, and the NMDA receptor has long been implicated in the pathogenesis of schizophrenia. In fact, cyclidine is a drug which blocks that receptor and can produce psychotic symptoms. And some of these patients present with schizophrenia. They're mistaken for schizophrenia, and they don't get better until the diagnosis is made and they're treated with immune suppressant drugs. They don't get better with antipsychotics. There are positron emission tomography imaging ways of imaging markers, drugs which bind to microglia, which are the brain's inflammatory phagocytes. In very small samples, a couple of studies suggest that those are also increased in patients with acute psychosis. And then finally, the atypicals do seem to have, in experimental paradigms, the ability to block microglial activation. So that, that could be why there's less grey matter loss, whatever it means, in the early schizophrenia. So we were interested to carry out a study of an inflammatory agent. If this is right, then an anti-inflammatory drug might be able to improve the outcome of schizophrenia early in the course of the illness. So we chose the agent Minocycline, which is an antibiotic. And interestingly, quite apart from its antibiotic activity, it is also an anti-inflammatory. So on the left-hand panel here, you can see a blood vessel at the top and brain substance underneath it. And on the top right of that panel, you can see a resting microglial cell, and these are phagocytes, inflammatory cells of the brain, and they get activated during inflammation and secrete local inflammatory markers, and together that has a neurotoxic effect. And that's all blocked by minocycline. Minocycline is used in rheumatoid arthritis and in systemic lupus erythematosus as an anti-inflammatory agent. Those things don't involve bugs. So we carried out a study of minocycline, added to treatment as usual for 1 year in patients within 5 years of their first illness. And we did it in Pakistan and Brazil, partly because we had the opportunity of two excellent senior members of staff in Manchester University, Imran Chowdhury and Nusrat Hussain, who had strong connections with groups in Pakistan. And here you see them training clinicians and other raters to assess the symptoms of schizophrenia using, for example, the positive and negative syndrome scale. We also collected patients in Brazil with Jaime Halak, a senior clinician who we've also collaborated with over many years. And you can see that we published the results of this double-blind randomized controlled trial and in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and you see the bottom line: minocycline benefits negative symptoms in early schizophrenia. And this was a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial for addition of minocycline for 1 year. So here are the data, and these are the PANSS scales, and the one to look at is the one that says PANSS negative symptoms, and you can see that the improvement in negative symptoms in the blue people, those are the people who had placebo, is less than those who were treated with minocycline. Minocycline improved the outcome in terms of negative symptoms. So there's a 5-point drop at least, which is a 5-point greater drop than occurs in the placebo group. And that is a clinically significant improvement. And there's no real effect on positive or other symptoms of psychosis. And this effect was found in Pakistan and in Brazil. In Brazil, there were 4 people who made remarkable improvements on schizophrenia across the board, whereas in Pakistan, it really was a selective effect on the negative symptoms. So there may be differences in populations, there may be some stratification, there may be some differentiation, heterogeneity in the psychosis. We think it's the right result because at the same time as we were doing our study, the Stanley Medical Research Foundation, which funded our study, also funded a parallel study, this time during the acute phase of psychosis with a 3 to 6 month follow-up, and they showed the same thing, basically, that negative symptoms improved more in the minocycline treated group in their sample of 21 completers. So we have no idea how minocycline works. I mean, it could be that it's anti-inflammatory, but we have other reasons for thinking that maybe it's doing something to glutamate as well. So to try and get at this, we are doing a major multi-center trial in the UK. It's called Benamin, and it's the same design as I just told you in Pakistan and Brazil, but this time we're doing imaging at the beginning and at the end to see if we can block those changes in grey matter in patients with early psychosis. And we're also measuring circulating cytokines. We're checking out other anti-inflammatory drugs, as you can see. Ondansetron and simvastatin have, in addition to their primary reactions, they're also anti-inflammatory in novel ways. And we're looking to see whether those individually or in combination might have a synergistic effect in improving negative symptoms in a very large sample that we're just about to analyze. And there are many other studies going on of anti-inflammatory agents. Hopefully the positron emission tomography studies are going to give us some insight into whether there is microglial activation in patients with schizophrenia. And finally, it's worth thinking about what the implications of these findings might be for prevention. So we know that the risk years are from late teens to late 30s, so potentially people would have to take, who are at risk, 20 years of a drug to stop the psychosis from happening. And therefore, it has to be a highly tolerable drug. Furthermore, we're not very good at predicting who's going to get psychosis. At the very best, in a 1-year follow-up, maybe 20%, it's probably a lot less than that. So most people who would be identified as being at risk through a family history or through having some early clinical features wouldn't benefit. They would be taking a preventative treatment for no reason. So it would have to be tolerable, and for that reason antipsychotic drugs too would be unacceptable. They might not even be effective in the prodromal period. They have the problem of causing the metabolic syndrome and all kinds of unpleasant effects. Furthermore, being on an antipsychotic is kind of stigmatizing and saying that you're a future schizophrenic, and therefore that's not a good thing for a preventative treatment. So the ability of minocycline, if we could understand how that worked, the ability of minocycline to prevent the negative symptoms could lead to new treatments that prevented the onset of psychosis in an acceptable way.